To begin that discussion, I would like to invite Dr. Mostert, Director of the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University, to deliver the keynote address.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Good morning. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here, and I'm very pleased to be in Africa's most northern country, and I bring you greetings from Africa's most southern country, from South Africa. You can see that I'm trying to play for time as I'm waiting for my presentation to appear on the screen. Perhaps I should try and open it here on the screen in front of me. We had it at the back there. Let me do that anyway. Okay, we've got some help. As you heard, I'm the director of the Institute for Futures Research at the University of Stellenbosch, and we are the first and remain the only Institute for Futures Research on the African continent. And much of the work we do has to do with the study of the future of Africa. And I'll share with you the idea of exploring the future world of work to inform skills policy. The first observation to make is that the laptop is freezing. Gosh, they're really putting me through my paces here. There we are. Here is a picture from 100 years ago that tries to create an image of what education, the acquisition of skill, might look like in the year 2000. What's interesting about that is you'll notice that is not that far away from what Elon Musk thinks education is going to be like in the next few decades, where knowledge is simply downloaded into a mesh at the base of the brain. Unfortunately, our university hasn't reached this level yet, but we're moving our way there. A very important principle for us of trying to study the future is what we call this 20-30-50 principle. It's a very sensitive principle. It says that there's a weighting in the way that we think about time and the importance, the relative importance of time. So in our view, we say if we're trying to study the future, about 20% of that should be spent on studying the past. This is a contentious issue for those who find a lot of their power base from the past. 30% should be spent on studying what's going on, and a conference like this is very much examining exactly that. What is going on? And that requires some consensus, and it requires some humility. But our argument is that at least 50% of the investigation should be spent on what hasn't happened yet, and what is about to happen. We have a very simple view. The only place we could possibly go is the future. So how about we study that? Now, this is an important idea because it examines, firstly, what exactly are we looking for? And secondly, what is the level of skill that we aspire to? And how far away are we? Are we indeed looking in the right places? So we are, of course, here in the exciting continent of Africa. You've heard the early speakers talk about what an amazing continent this is. And Africa has, and this is part of the study we do, an amazing intellectual history. Here's an example of Ptolemy in Alexandria, a research institute where luminaries such as Archimedes and Euclid studied, where Aristarchus of Samos studied, the enormous library, of course, that was there. That was not an exception. Of course, in Ethiopia and Eritrea, the erstwhile Axum, we have the history of the written language going back literally thousands of years, with inscriptions on coins being found 2,000 years ago. We have, of course, Augustine of Hippo, around 430 AD, who studied two things that you will hear about on CNN every day. One rational beings possessing free will. Many psychologists would argue this is one of the greatest discoveries in the last 50 years. People can choose. Who knew? And secondly, just war theory. What is a just war? And if you look at CNN today, you'll see the work of Augustine of Hippo appearing on CNN almost every day. Well, of course, what about the history of universities? For many, Al-Qarawiyyin, an African university in Fez in Morocco, was the world's first university in 859. Of course, we know that Siddiqui College here in Tunisia was a forerunner of what would become many leading scholars on the African continent. It turns out that's not an aberration. About 100 years later, we had Al-Azhar University in Cairo. It would be another almost 1,000 years before Fora Bay College was established. And then, of course, we all know what happened around the 1850s. When Europeans came to Africa and chopped it up as if it is its own little pizza, with no regard of the natural flow of indigenous knowledge, or indigenous people, or indigenous creatures. Let's leap forward 2,000 years and look at how Africa is perceived by some in the more capitalist-oriented world. Here is the front cover of The Economist in May 2000 that refers to the continent as the hopeless continent. Let's leap forward about a year. And very rapidly now, Africa is rising. And this would turn out to be the vicissitudes of dialogue for the next 2 decades, as Africa rises and falls in the perceptions of those who wish to invest in her. Just a year later, Time magazine uses exactly the same title, and I'm sure The Economist had a thing or two to say about that. But in their view also, Africa was rising. A year after that, The Economist refers to Africa as aspiring. And we see this emergence of hope. 4 years after that, The Economist looks at making Africa work. A much more pragmatic view, asking questions not only about the sort of philosophical origins of the new Africa of the 1950s, but more pragmatically, how can we actually get things done? And most recently, in August of 2016, The Economist studies Africa's fragile democracies. But it seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, that a debate on the quality of the democracy is a much better debate than a debate on the extent to which the continent is hopeless just 10 years ago. So indeed, my suspicion is that we are at an opportune moment in the history, the story, the multi-millennial story of Africa, and we are investigating an important question in this conference, as we are all disrupted and excited by the technology to come. It was only recently that we realized the true size of Africa. And we realized just what an enormous part of the world, geographically, we live in. Of course, not everybody understands Africa well, and the Origin Man in the United States recently referred to the ambassador who will be coming to Nambia, and thus illustrates a lot of the ignorance, of course, that still exists about our continent. He's not a man put off by ignorance, and of course referred to us in rather unflattering terms most recently. So Africa does have still a little bit of an image problem. For those scientists among you, the ones who like the numbers, there are the numbers. You've all heard of the demographic dividends. For those not familiar with it, it's the idea of the balance of those of working age as a percentage of those of ages between 0 and 15 and 64 plus. And as you can see, that's how Africa compares to the rest of the world. So you can see this base of young people. So as you study the future of Africa, something we do on a day-to-day basis for our clients, you can see that in the next few decades, Africa will have, as UNICEF has argued in one paper, by 2040, Africa will have 4 in every 10 of the world's young people. Just consider that for a moment. By 2040, 4 out of every 10 young people on the planet will be an African. So a rich market indeed, even if you look at it from a capitalist perspective. There's the number in a graph, and you can see how far that demographic dividend extends. For sub-Saharan Africa there, that dividend extends to around 2060, almost mid-2060s, which means for the next few decades, sub-Saharan Africa at least has this amazing opportunity to benefit from this demographic dividend. There are some statistics that shows the status quo, if that's an important dimension. And you can see that sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, this is from the Global Competitiveness Index, is not quite, at least in the view of the rest of the world, where we could be. So the question is, if Africa does have skill, is that skill useful? You'll be surprised to know that just in the last few years, 314 active tech hubs have been created on the continent in 93 cities in 42 countries. I think this is a staggering finding. What that means is all over the continent, more and more young people are concerning themselves with creating their own destiny. I find this enormously exciting as an emerging trend. So perhaps while we are at this conference debating what it's all about, they are already doing it. Of course, organizations find themselves within this context with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, Agenda 2063 of the AU, and of course, this global trend for national development plans to illustrate what the long-term future of the country might be. And I think this is an enormously exciting time to be a business because the context is just so rich. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, our interest is in the study of the future, of a time yet to come. It's a curious thing because decisions are always made in the present. Even if you make that decision tomorrow, it will be the present then. Decisions, unfortunately, are almost always made based on the past. The real conundrum is that decisions can only be made for the future. This is a curious idea. Made in the present, based on the past, made for the future. It is for that reason that we argue that those who know where they come from also know where they've been. Now, we get a lot of observation that this is a misquote, and it should in fact read, of course, that those who know where they come from also know where they're going. We've seen very little scientific evidence of that theory, because it would suggest that the best futurists in the world are, of course, historians. And there's almost no evidence that historians are among the most innovative technologists on the continent. We work in the area of strategic competitiveness, both for governments and for business. And a key important strategic question for us is, how is the world asymmetrically structured in favor of Africa? How is the world asymmetrically structured in favor of Africa? Why that is an important question is because that means that our view, strategically speaking, is that Africa shouldn't try to catch up. You only try to be prepared for the future if you are not creating that future. Now, we've already seen that Africa has an immensely rich intellectual history. We have also seen that all across the continent, young people are creating already the technology that Africa will need. So how is Africa asymmetrically favored by the current global dispensation? Well, its demographic dividend is one of those opportunities, and its enormous potential for innovation is yet another. But Africa, of course, must create a confidence triad that gives confidence, firstly, to government, in which policy certainty must feature, and certainly for our business clients, this is an important dimension for studying the future. How certain is that policy? Or are we just going where the political winds are blowing us? That policy certainty gives rise to investment, and that investment gives rise to citizen confidence, which demonstrates itself in terms of healthy consumers and in terms of civil participation. So this triad of confidence is essential for the future of Africa, and governments and policies certainly have a key role to play there. I would be remiss with my Deputy Minister of Higher Education here if I didn't point out that in the South African Constitution is ensconced in Section 16 academic freedom and freedom of scientific research. Put up your hand if your Constitution protects academic freedom. I just thought I'd show off there for a little bit. But what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is as new democracies in Africa are being created, so we are beginning to respect the value of academic research and the power that that can have on the future of Africa. So, as with all thinkers and students of paradigms and future opportunities, we try to model the opportunity. So if we look at the three variables there, if we look at what we call the ACE of base in space model for Africa, the first question is, what's the base? What's the base? How high are we on that base? What's the current starter level for Africa? And of course, there's enormous discrepancy, and some would say the base isn't very high. What about the pace? How quickly are we moving? Because future success will depend not only on the base. In that sense, Western Europe and North America are far ahead of us. It is the pace, really, that will determine whether we are competitive. And then, how about the space? Are we creating the space for young people and for business to help us to move the way forward? And our view is that even though the base score on Africa is generally quite low, the pace score is much higher. We heard the representative from the Tunisian government explain the enormous growth rates that we find in certain African countries. We now need to create the space in which young people can help us to see the way. In other words, colleagues, I'm submitting to you, among other things, that not only is it the role in our conference to show the way, but also how can we create the space in which younger people may help us to see that way. So our view, as perhaps you were hearing, is that Africa cannot wait for time to tell. Africa must tell time. We will realize very shortly that skills that young people are developing have exceeded even our own education, and it is perhaps time for young people to show the way. You've been a lovely audience. Enjoy your conference. It's been my honor. Thank you very much.
So, sorry for the break. Thank you very much, Dr. Mostert. We will probably go for a tea break right now and then come back later to discuss all of this in details.